All right, hi everyone. My name is Eric Nguyen. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm the director of the Center for Inclusive Excellence at Framingham State University.
Hi everyone, my name is Ariel. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the program coordinator at the Center for Inclusive Excellence.
So Ariel, I've realized recently a lot of students have mentioned they're not really looking forward to end of the semester and being home for break. It turns out a lot of them are worried about having to take part in conversations where family members might express bigoted comments or views, maybe conveying racism, sexism, homophobia, and so on. And it seems like it's particularly stressful this year because students have finally been able to get out of the house for a semester, escaping some of those toxic environments, and now there's a lot of concern and anxiety about having to return to that during the break.
Yeah, that sounds like a big concern. Conversations with family are so tricky to have because they're family and you've grown up with them, you have deep relationships with some of them, you have a history. So it's not like you can just walk away like it might be some stranger on the street.
Yeah.
It's a little more difficult than that.
Right. Yeah, and I feel like within families too, this is certainly true with mine, that there are always power dynamics that you might need to navigate, like whose voice carries weight in your family, like who do people actually listen to? And then, also asking questions about what are the cultural norms around challenging one's elders or expressing dissenting views or opinions.
Yeah, I can definitely relate that certain family members of mine, if they're coming to a family event, you kind of have to prepare for it. It's definitely not as easy as maybe me just being around my siblings. So what can we do in response to these situations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I want to do today is just introduce a framework for how they can act in these situations. And we're actually going to use the three letters in ACT, A.C.T. So A stands for address the situation head on. C stands for create a distraction or a delay. And then T stands for team up with someone else. And what we'll do is we'll walk through each of these so that our listeners have a range of options. We'll talk about the pros and cons of each approach. And it's also important to note that sometimes in these situations, you're a bystander, meaning you're not the victim or the target of the comments, but you recognize that they're problematic, that they're offensive, and you want to say something about it, even if members of the target group aren't present. And then there are also going to be times where the comments might impact you directly. And I find that sometimes it can be harder to speak up in these instances because you are now feeling emotionally attacked, right, by the comments. And so regardless of whether you're a bystander or you're the victim, the strategies we're going to talk about will apply to both situations.
Yeah, it's great that there are so many options because most people feel like it's hard to battle these head on, or they don't know what to do at all, so they might just walk away. And a lot of times you don't want to approach a situation on your own. So it sounds like with the ACT framework, you have other options and different responses that you can do.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of these, right? So A, right, address the situation head on. And I think that's what most people think they have to do, is address the situation head on and challenge the sentiment that's being expressed. And you can certainly do that. Again, it depends on who the person is who's making these comments. It's like who else is in the room, how comfortable you might feel. But if you're going to challenge the sentiment, I might use phrases like, well, in my experience, that hasn't been the case, right? And sort of lead in that way as a way to I have a different opinion or a different viewpoint that I want to share. You can also, make it a little bit more personal. You can say what you're saying is really hurtful. I want to draw your attention to that, because sometimes people actually don't understand, that what they're saying is problematic. And so you might just appeal, to their empathetic side. What you're saying is really hurtful. And then other times, again, you might take a direct approach by saying, I would appreciate if you just didn't say things like that, right? They're not true. They can cause a lot of harm. And I'd like to ask you to stop.
Yeah, it seems like something that would be a little less direct would be to find a common ground with the person that you're expressing your feelings to. Maybe say something like, I felt that way at one point, and now my opinion has changed because of this and that. So you can kind of relate to them and explain how it might be different now. You can also, if it's a family member or if it's like a friend and you have similar values, you can use that to find common ground. Like, we don't think that this is okay in these types of situations, so why would it be okay here? And if you can be like, I was raised this way, you were also raised this way. Let's kind of find that common ground there.
Right. Yeah. Like we were raised to be inclusive, right? Or we were raised to see differences as a good thing, right? Not as something to talk down, right, to other people about. So like your comments right now don't really reflect that. So I like that too, right? Like I said, a lot of people feel like they have to address it head on, and what you suggested is something that is a little bit less direct, might help the other person feel like they're less attacked as well. And maybe there is an opportunity to meet, right, in the middle and come to a better understanding about why what they're saying is problematic. The other thing I often suggest to people too is like, just be proactive and set limits ahead of time, right? Especially in this situation, like students have already said, like, I am worried about going into these conversations. So you know who the people are who might be making these problematic comments, when it's going to happen. And so you might be able to address it proactively and do it ahead of time, especially if that person is not part of your immediate household. A lot of times we have these extended family dinners, or, friends and family are coming over. And so you might be able to communicate and set some boundaries with them ahead of time. So you might be able to call them up or send them an email or a text and say, listen, every year at the dinner table, you find a way to start talking about, X, Y, or Z, right? And you make a lot of really insensitive comments. The comments are hurtful to me. I would really appreciate it if you would avoid doing that this year. So you try to establish those expectations ahead of time. So in hopes, right, that when you get to that dinner table or get to that family gathering, you can just avoid doing this altogether.
Yeah, all of these options are super helpful. And they're just like really great. And I feel like I could insert them into my family dynamic. But there's also always those relatives who might just take what they're saying as a joke, and they won't give in when you approach something. It's almost like they know that they're saying something wrong because you've told them, but they're still going to do it to, push those buttons and get on your nerves or for the entertainment.
They just want to get a rise out of you, right?
Yeah. I learned recently that it's very effective to ask them, like, what's funny about that joke? Like, why is that a joke? And have them explain themselves, because oftentimes they don't really know how to explain it. Then you can continue and have a conversation about like where that joke's coming from.
Yeah, it just puts them on the spot, right? And forces them to really confront what they're saying. And even if they thought it was funny to begin with, it's really hard to explain why it's funny without admitting that it's funny because I'm being really mean to you right now, right? And I think that sort of forces people to stop as well. I really like that. And in moments like that too, I think sometimes you also just recognize that trying to prolong the conversation, sometimes we get into this back and forth, and now like I have to convince them or I have to keep telling them that it's wrong. Sometimes you try multiple approaches. You do the soft, more indirect approach, and then you do the more direct approach, or maybe you even try to do this proactively. You actually called them and told them ahead of time, like, please don't do this. You have another choice, right? And that's to end the conversation and just to walk away and not to continue to engage with this person, because it's clearly escalating and not de-escalating. So you might just say, it's clear that we're not going to resolve this today. We're not going to come to an understanding on this. It's not productive for me to continue engaging with you. So I'm going to walk away right now. And I know sometimes it's really hard. Our egos feel like they take a blow in those moments, but it's really important for our own sort of mental, psychological, emotional health to be able to do that, but it also might be helpful to the people around us to move on from that situation as well.
Yeah, it seems like in those situations where you might know ahead of time that addressing it head on is not the best option. Like we mentioned in the beginning, the power dynamics, the cultural norms, or the setting that you're in. There's like, what other options would there be?
Right. Yeah. And in addition to all of that, you might also have to consider, like, how's that person going to react, right? Is that somebody who gets really aggressive, and might turn their attack on you, like, especially if they weren't, right, targeting you in that moment? Might that person now become aggressive towards you, double down on their stance? Other people actually might sort of feel a lot of shame, right, and get very defensive about it. So in that moment, they clearly understand what they did was wrong, but their response actually redirects the attention back onto them, right, rather than those people that they've harmed as well. So we might have to think about a different way to address that person or that situation. So in those cases, like, that's where I come to the C, right? Like, create a distraction or like try to delay the situation somehow.
Yeah, like if you like knocked over a glass of water or maybe like threw something on the ground.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Like, you just want to get everyone's attention away from what's happening or what that person said and be like, oops, right. Like you knocked the glass over. If you don't want to create such a mess, like you said, like maybe you just drop a fork or a spoon, like it just creates like a loud enough noise that everyone's like, ooh, like what just happened there, right? And it's just that momentary pause that can really help to diffuse a situation. Sometimes I've been in situations where I pretend I have to take a phone call and leave the room, and I'll announce it. I was like, oh, sorry, everyone, I have to take this call, right? So everyone just turns and looks at me for a second. Or you could even, again, focus on why you're there. Be like, wow, like this appetizer is really delicious, right? Have you all tried it yet? And maybe you walk around with the plate, right? And just get people to take it off the plate for you.
Yeah, I can imagine that if you're the person who might have been the bystander and you were in the conversation directly, you could kind of jump in and be like, oh, hey, like, Eric, can I like see you in the kitchen, or can we talk? Like, I've been meaning to talk to you all night, and kind of give them that escape route from the situation.
Exactly, right? You just like rescue them in that moment and like take them away. And sometimes you actually might take the offending person away, right? And you allow the person who's been targeted to stay in that space with everyone else, and you remove the person. But yeah, you remove one of those two people. And just because you're creating a distraction in that moment doesn't mean that you can't come back later and then address the situation head on, right? Sometimes you just need a moment to clear your head, take a deep breath, prepare yourself to have the conversation, because sometimes they do catch us off guard. And even in those moments where we're feeling like we're really prepared, sometimes our emotions can really overtake us, so it might create that distraction. And then later on you come back and you say, hey, like earlier today, like before I knocked over that glass of water, like you started to say something, and that just didn't really sit well with me. Can we revisit that, right?
Yeah. Earlier you mentioned the T in ACT stands for team up with someone. So like you said, you could team up with someone in a later time to help you approach the situation. I think you would just need to have a pre-conversation with them before you told them to come and directly approach that person who might have been offending someone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you definitely have to do it ahead of time. Like, they need to know that they're on your team, right? It's harder to like try to pull people on in the moment if they're not prepared for it. So, maybe for the big family dinner, right? I pull my brother aside and I say, hey, Nick, Uncle Ming always finds a way to begin to make homophobic remarks during dinner. I'm just not okay with it. I'm going to say something about it if it happens again this year. And would you be willing to back me up in that moment, right? So it gives my brother a heads up that this is what's going to happen. And it gives him then some time to prepare, to think about how he might respond or what he might say, and allows us to strategize a little bit as well.
Yeah, or you could even ask that person to say something first. Maybe they're in a better position to address the situation. And because of their relationship to the person, their position or power within the family, they could even make that phone call ahead of time to set some boundaries before the situation becomes problematic.
Yeah, exactly, right? That again, like, you don't always have to be the person to address it, right? You might recognize that there's a problem here, but somebody else might be better suited to address the situation, right? Or somebody might be better able to get the point across because, like you said, their position, their power, the cultural norms that exist there. And again, right, I think it's really important to emphasize, like, you don't have to, most of the time, like, you don't have to face these situations alone. Like, you shouldn't have to. There have been times where, like, knowing that, like, say my brother's not going to be able to make it home for that dinner, like, I might say, hey, can I invite a friend over, right? And that friend becomes my ally and my source of support. And so you can usually find somebody who is going to, to have your back. and then you owe them big time, right? Because now you're inviting somebody in to experience that environment that your family has created. But again, a lot of times I feel like there are other people in the room who feel the same way that you do, right? They're also offended. They just don't know what to do or to say, like they don't know how to act. And that's one reason why the bystander effect happens, right? A lot of people recognize there's a problem and then nobody does anything about it. And I mentioned bystander a couple times. A lot of the strategies we discussed here are ones that you would actually encounter in an active bystander or a microaggressions training. So anyone who's listening here, hasn't attended one of those trainings or hasn't done it in a while, would certainly encourage you to attend so that you can learn more and get some practice too.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's one thing to know what to say, but then to actually take on the action of doing it and approaching a situation is another. Sometimes it's difficult to try and have the right phrases, depending on who you're talking to, or the right tone. You want it to be authentic. So
right. Yeah, I think people sometimes find like role playing is really kind of hokey, but at the same time, like until you hear those words actually come out of your mouth, you have no idea if you can even say them, So and on the last basis where people are like, Eric, like just tell me what to say. And what I remind them is I said, like, this is what I would say. It is probably not what you would say, right? So you have to practice and find those words that work for you. I think it's a really good point about the need to practice, So we hope this conversation is a useful resource for anyone who's watching. Again, for many reasons, the winter break, the holiday season can be stressful enough. And knowing, ahead of time how you can respond to these challenging situations and conversations can reduce some of that stress. It's not going to take it away or eliminate it entirely, but it certainly helps to have a plan. So if you have any questions, want to follow up on any of this, feel free to stop by the Center for Inclusive Excellence.
Yes, we're located on the first floor of O'Connor Hall. When you first enter the building, you're just going to walk straight ahead and enter through the double glass doors. You can also email us at inclusivex@framingham.edu.